All right. So first, kind of the introduction to debate online. Everyone's pretty much agreed for the 2020-2021 competitive season. It's pretty much entirely online. I think the certainty of that probably ends around March-ish. And then I think from there, it's dependent upon what a lot of things look like. But I think for planning purposes and everything else, it just makes sense to assume that everything's online. The NDT has announced that it will be online next March. So I find it hard to believe that high school tournaments will do differently. I do think that high school tournaments will probably be the first ones to go back in person prior to college. And I think one of the components to that is high school debate season is longer. So there's just like more time to figure life out. And so I think that's kind of a portion of that. NSDA hasn't announced if their tournament's going to be online or not. I think that's a tournament that actually might be in person. But these are my opinions and they are not facts. In terms of schedules for most tournaments next year, everyone's looking at, and again, not facts, things that I've talked about, things that I think people are looking at. So don't be like, but they told me. But most tournaments are looking at a 3-3-4 model type schedule. So it seems that we'll be moving away from a TOC schedule where it was like 4 or 5 days and shortening that to probably about a 3-day tournament model. So they're looking to have no more than 3 or 4 rounds a day. The general consensus seems to be that more than 3 or 4 rounds a day is unnecessarily exhausting and probably something that is not what people want to be doing. I would also reason to guess that there's benefits to this 3-day tournament model, right? We already don't have travel days. And so I think moving or keeping that 3-day tournament model also minimizes school miss, which is sometimes good. We'll talk about that more when we talk about silver linings and such. I also think in terms of schedules and things like that, there's a lot of the national tournaments. So I would say like quarter octafinals tournaments are trying to account for national competition, so time changes. I think as the bids get higher up in the elimination round, so like semis, finals, etc., I would think that those time change adjustments might happen a little less. So now we're going to talk about tools that are needed for debating online. First and foremost, headset, obviously, with external microphone. So these are super cheap gaming headsets, totally work. I would say the key component is it should be wired. So it should be wired to your computer. And the reason for that is it would prevent lag in terms of communications through the microphone to the computer, which can be helpful, particularly when spreading. If you look, there is a Michigan demo debate where some of the debaters are using external microphones and some of the debaters are not, and the differences is like night and day. So I think the external microphone, the one that comes over in front of your mouth, is particularly important, but it doesn't have to be really expensive, especially because it's wired, right? The ones that I've been looking at on Amazon are very cheap. They are like $20 to $30, and that I think is particularly important. The next thing, or the next recommendation I have, is having a conversation with your partner and your coach as to where you'll be debating. You should not endanger yourself or others by, debating in the same room if that's not something that is feasible or safe given, where you live and stuff like that. Obviously, I live in South Florida and we're like averaging 17,000 cases a day. So my debaters will not be debating in the same room with one another. But that's a conversation and a decision that you all should have now and plan that out. If I'm going to make the assumption that you're not debating in the same room, so you also then need to have a conversation as to what type of communication will you have with your debate partner. I think there's two main sources that this communication can happen during debate rounds. The first is just having a simple phone call and just keeping it on the entire time and just muting it when you're debating. I think that cuts down on time of like having to call, having the other person to answer, stuff like that. The other solution is Discord, which I haven't used a lot, but I know a lot of people do. And that is also a solution to that verbal communication that you would need during prep time. And I think that's particularly good. Things like Slack are also great, obviously. I think if your team didn't use Slack before, using it now is pretty vital. I also think that it's very helpful for you and your partner to have just a Slack channel for during debate. And some of the concerns people are voicing are like, my partner can't tap me and tell me to move on and stuff like that. But if you situate your monitors and your windows in a way, you can still see those messages from your partner. So you can move on or not forget the perm or whatever it may be, and that communication can still happen. The other thing that I think that you probably need to figure out is where you are in relation to the router in your home, whether or not that's good. So I'm on a wireless connection right now. Myself and my fiance Shri can both be on Zoom and not have a problem. But we're also not debating, right? We're judging, we're giving lectures, etc. So if we were to lose the connection, it would be significantly less of a problem for us than if it was for a debater. I would test out different locations in your home to figure out where the strongest connection is. And I would look into getting an Ethernet port. So if there's significant lag, just plugging into the router is a really easy solution to that. Most of the newer computers don't have Ethernet ports, so you would need to like buy an adapter. But I think that's a great solution to ensure that you have quick internet. I don't think you need to buy lightning fast internet. You probably don't even need to upgrade your internet in your home. We have like 100 megabytes per second is what our internet is, and it's fine. But you want to make sure that it's quick enough that you're not having issues. I think a good litmus test of that is stuff like camp. Like I think one of the huge reasons why stuff like online camp right now is so important is because it allows you to test out different ways to debate online at a very low cost to you, AKA you're not losing tournaments by practicing this. The next thing I would recommend is getting an external monitor or two. So this wasn't viable when we were moving from room to room at an in-person debate tournament, but you're in one place and having multiple screens, I think is really good. I think what's really helpful with that is it allows you to have your speech doc open as well as still be able to see the Zoom call so you can still see everyone. And I think we can problem solve this. Maybe you all have another solution. I can't conceptualize a way that you can backflow for your partner that does not necessitate you all flowing on a computer. Like I just don't know what that looks like. Am I missing something? So I do think flowing on a computer for debaters will become more in vogue again, if you will. And I think backflowing, being able to flow with your monitor, I think is particularly important. I would say also just ensuring you're able to move stuff around. So we'll talk about this when we talk about Ethos, but you want to be able to like still set your laptop up on a table tote before you give speeches. Questions about tools needed? Anything I missed that you all want to discuss? Cool. So the next kind of section of this is the various platforms that can be used for online competition. And there's 4. There might be other random ones, but the ones that I'm familiar with and I've heard discussed are the 4 main ones. The first one is classrooms.clouds. This is what the TOC used. Did any of y'all compete at the TOC this year? Did any of y'all compete at NSDA Nationals this year? Okay, not a big deal, just curious. That was what was used for both of those tournaments. It's really just a template for Zoom. So you go into their website, go to a room, and then it will bring you to a Zoom window. There's some nice features on like the tournament setup portion of it that's particularly helpful. It's also fairly seamless for competitors. I mean, during NSCA Nationals, that's like 2,000, 3,000 humans, all on the same platform. It crashed once for about 30 minutes tops. So I think that is a really good thing about it. It is a little expensive. I think what will end up happening, again, opinions, not facts. I think what will end up happening is whatever software the first like 1 or 2 tournaments of the year end up using, most people will use. I think a majority of the larger tournaments are going to probably be using Classroom.cloud simply because that's what the TOC and NSCA Nationals use. It's tested. Also, if you're part of like the high school policy debate page, you can see if there's lots of advocates for that as a solution. There are a few other solutions or other platforms. The second one is one that is not out yet, but I think we're actually piloting it during some of our debate rounds, which is the NSCA platform. So the NSCA platform will be linked through Tabroom, so that'll be particularly useful. It's probably going to be cheaper than Classroom.cloud. Classroom.cloud is kind of the most expensive one at the moment. And it will still, again, be a template that is overlaid with Zoom, which is also what Classroom.cloud is. So regardless of how you get into it, you're ultimately in a Zoom room doing a debate round. The third is just Zoom breakout rooms, right? So that's what you've also probably used already in lab or you will use. That I anticipate will be used for like scrimmages, maybe local tournaments, things that are smaller. It's very easy then to have one Zoom manager and then have, you know, umpteen breakout rooms where that can happen. So I think those three are all using Zoom. The last one, and I haven't heard a whole lot about it since the NDCA conference, is called Yatly, Y-A-A-T-L-Y. It is another virtual tournament platform. I think what is notable or different with Yatly is that it is in fact not using Zoom. So it's still using video conferencing, but it's not ultimately ending up in a Zoom room like the other three are. It's not really tested yet, right? So there's not, you know, necessarily a lot of good examples. I know there are some big proponents of it at the NDCA conference that we went to. This one so Classroom.cloud charges per room. This is charging per person. So it's just a little different of like a price breakdown. I would encourage you to go look at both of their websites, Classroom.cloud and Yatly, and then NSCA when they bring out theirs, just to be more familiar with it. I don't think you ever want your first time using any of these online platforms to be round one of a debate tournament. So oftentimes they'll offer like practice rooms, or you could get special pricing to practice, and I think those are beneficial for you. Just so that I think the general rule should be your first time using the platform should not be round one of a tournament. Does anyone have any questions about the different platforms? Cool. Next thing, so now that we've kind of talked about like the nuts and bolts, if you will, of online debate, we're now going to talk about Ethos in debate rounds, and then we will talk about some tips and tricks. So the first and most important thing that I can say is I think your camera has to be on during debate rounds. I think the camera has to be on for many reasons, but I think the most important is it's very easy for someone, just like a human, to tune out someone that they can't physically see. So I think your camera has to be on no matter what. The second thing is I think you have to stand up while speaking. I think you need to stand up while speaking, probably even stand up while doing cross-X. I think that's probably a gray area. But not only is it important for you in terms of your ability to be clear, spread, drawing enough air through your diaphragm, etc., but I think it's also important in terms of ethos, because you are standing, you are ready to debate, and I think that's just very important. I also then think that means when you're doing speaking drills, you also should be doing them standing up. I think it's very easy to like be crouched down and hunched over on your desktop and not be aware that you're like giving a speech. The third thing is I think you need to be conscious of volume of the speech. So again, this goes back to the first time you debating online should not be around one of a debate tournament, but also you should be conscious of what you sound like while spreading on Zoom. And I think part of that is doing stuff like speaking drills. I think, you know, being aware of how loud you are speaking. So we normally tend to yell or project our volume really loudly when we are debating in person, but that is a whole classroom for us to project our volume into. If you are standing and you have a microphone right here in front of your face, your ability to project that volume becomes just onto that microphone. Not only can it be very jarring, right, to all of a sudden be shouted at, most people are wearing headphones. It's probably a little painful, but also they're probably missing arguments that you are then saying. So being conscious to not having to shout like you normally would. I think the next thing is eye contact. So I think you want to be aware of where your eyes are during a Zoom call. Probably one of the best things I did was I hid my self view. So I'm not staring at myself the whole time, right? Because that it can make you self-conscious. But doing those things, I think, also then help replicate a real debate round, because you're not staring at a mirror, you're staring at other people. But I think that's particularly important. I think the other thing that goes into as well is when you have multiple monitors set up, make sure that the speech doc you're reading is probably on the monitor with the camera, right? So you're still staring, or you still have that eye contact component, and you're looking at what the reactions are of the other people in the debate round. That feedback can still happen. It's a lot harder over Zoom, but it's certainly still going to be there. I also think it's really difficult so like I have two monitors. If I was giving my lecture to y'all like this the whole time, because I'm looking at my other monitor and looking at like all of the notes and stuff, like no one wants to do that, right? No one wants to watch someone, listen to someone that they're clearly not looking at y'all. There's been a lot of research about Zoom calls and like video conferencing and stuff since all of this stuff happened. And there is certainly an increased amount of eye strain that happens with being on Zoom calls. And someone did some research and concluded that one of the reasons is you're never actually making eye contact with people, which makes a lot of sense. Think about it. When you're talking, I'm not looking directly at the camera. I'm looking at the Zoom window with all y'all's faces in it, which I think I'm making eye contact with you all because I'm looking at you, but I'm not making eye contact to you as individuals. And so it increases the amount of strain on like your eyes and your brain and stuff like that. That's also why it sometimes feels like you're extra tired after like Zoom things because of that as well. So being conscious of those things I think matters. I also think what's in your background probably is important. So being aware of where you are sitting, what it looks like behind you. It doesn't have to be fancy by any means, but a plain background is pretty clutch. I think the other component to that as well is it can certainly be like a sheet that you've pinned up, whatever it may be. but also you don't want like inappropriate posters if you're in your room and stuff like that as well. Just being conscious of what's going on behind you. Do you all have other questions about Ethos while on camera?
Yeah, so did you say that you should look in should you look in the camera, or like how do you think you should approach that?
I think it's hard, right? Because you need, especially in things like cross-ex, right? Like you want to be able to like look at something. I think that you should just be conscious of where your eyes are. So like general direction of the camera, I think is good. What I will often do is, especially if I've hidden my self view, I will make the zoom window as wide as possible and put it up at the top of my screen. So at least I'm closer to looking at the camera as opposed to anything else. Do you all have other questions about that? I think the last thing is also being conscious of what the camera angle is, right? So there's a big difference from like this. So I have my laptop on a laptop stand, which might also go under like tools and equipment, which I absolutely love because it functionally makes my laptop a desktop. And it was like $10 on Amazon. But I think that helps because then the view isn't, this, which can often happen when doing Zoom calls. So being aware of stuff like that as well, I think matters. Just like before when, you thought about like if you were going to stand, what stickers are on your laptop, etc. It's just a different type of ethos and round presence that we need to be aware of. Other questions about ethos? Oh, go for it, Oscar.
Yeah,
what's up?
I have a question. So whenever I had kind of thought of online debate, I always envisioned like maybe you'd get your phone out and like have it, and like you'd have your like stand up on the other side of the room so they can see the whole shebang, like you can still do this thing, but like it sounds like that's not really the way it's going to work. Like it's going to be on the computer, like you're looking at it and they don't really see the stand. And see, my concern is like I spent a lot of time like trying to get really good at not just like reading blocks and like looking at my flow and being able to do the whole thing. But it sounds like that's not as, it's not really going to like, I'm not going to reap the benefits from that since it's, there's no really way to tell either way. How do you think you can kind of approach the whole
yeah, I mean, I think the ethos of like walking up to give a 1AR with gesture flows might be lost for a little bit. But I think that also just depends on like, do you want a separate laptop that's just Zoom? You could also do that. It's more equipment, right? So I think that's kind of the other component of this is I think particularly policy debate is in a unique position right now where our numbers have been decreasing for years. And this is a point where those numbers can increase because a lot of the hurdles of like being the only school in a district that does policy debate or not being able to travel, like those go away right now. So I think there's increased emphasis on less stuff to be able to do it. But it's also just like what makes sense to you. So if it makes sense to like have a separate laptop that's just Zoom, maybe like an older computer that's probably only going to run that and nothing else, that's also a possibility. But I just think you're getting ethos in different ways. And I think stuff like not reading blocks, going up for the 1AR with just paper, like that stuff matters, but that probably doesn't matter as much as giving good speeches.
Very reasonable.
Do you all have other questions? Cool. So the next section is kind of like tips and tricks. So again, not exhaustive. The first one I have is you always want to practice, when you go back to school, whether that be in person, virtually, whatever your district is doing, you should still be practicing like you play, which means all of your debate stuff should be on a computer. You should have practices online. You should give speeches online. You should do spreading online. Like, those things have to happen. You should also be recording yourself and hearing how you sound through the microphone, through the computer, so you can be aware of that. The next thing I have is you should always be recording your speeches, maybe on your phone, maybe just, on your computer as an audio. If you have a PC, Verbatim has that function. But you should always be recording your speeches. I think there's two main reasons for this. The first is, if you have a problem with your technology, if your internet goes out halfway through your speech, you can then be like, here's my speech, I recorded all of it, right? And you can send that, or you can replay it and not forget what you were saying. But the second is, I think it becomes a lot easier for you to be able to do things like redo, because you've recorded your speeches. You can listen to them afterwards and then be like, oh, that's what I actually sound like. Or, oh, I thought my explanation was X when really it came out as Y, right? And doing things like that. I think it's another silver lining of online debate right now, is the amount of debates that we have recorded and videoed after this year will be exponentially larger than previous years, which I think is really great. The next thing, and I've said this before, is the external microphone. I really think that's probably one of the biggest things and the biggest changes that needs to happen. But again, do not spend more than like $30 on a headset. You do not need a fancy gaming headset that lights up. You just need something. But you do also want to be conscious of like how they feel on your head, right? So like, my Beats are a little old, so they hurt my ears after a couple of hours. So being aware of what that feels like on that as well. The next thing is, you want to be aware of how many devices are on your network and see if you can turn stuff off. So something as simple as turning off Alexa for a period of time, I think is helpful, because that's less devices on your network while you are doing it. Also, if you live with like siblings, right? Maybe bribing said sibling to not like stream their gaming video, whatever. You can clearly tell I know what I'm talking about. While you're debating is also helpful. And then you need to plan ahead, right? So where will you debate? Are you debating in the dining room? Are you debating in an office? Are you debating in your bedroom? All of these locations are perfectly fine, but those should be planned out and discussed with, custodial units, guardians, parental units, etc., prior to debate tournaments happening. So you shouldn't just assume, but that should be a conversation that happens, so they're aware of the expectations of what happens during a tournament. Anything else?
Yeah, one thing came to my head. Attire. What are you thinking? Like, should you probably like dress in the same way that you would at a physical tournament, or what do you think?
I think there's kind of two sides to that, right? The first is I'm loving rocking leggings every day of the week. But I think I think there's that component where like bottom or top up probably matters more than bottom down. We handed out goodie bags to all of our NSDA qualifiers. Like, we drove around and did drive-bys, and we were doing it during the tournament. And so like the number of children that had like sweatpants and like button-up shirt and tie was very high. It was adorable. But I think there's that kind of level to it, right? And I talk about this later on as well. I think there's also kind of a point of like getting into that mindset of being at a tournament. So I think that's one of definitely the drawbacks of online debate, is like it's hard to get that adrenaline. It's hard to like be in a tournament. And so I think doing as many things as possible for it to be like a regular tournament is also helpful. So if like your brain works better where you're like, I'm dressed, I'm ready to go, boom, then that might be a different response than someone who's like, no, that's probably fine. Anyone have other questions right now? Okay, so the next section is kind of like potential problems you may encounter and how I recommend you resolve them as we go through. The first is tech issues during debates. So there's definitely going to be tech issues. That's an inevitability. You should not go through your season assuming that you will never have a tech issue. We lost internet the first day of generics, right? And like 5 minutes before the generics was supposed to start, and we didn't have internet. And so basic things like that, you will have a technical failure at some point during the year. The question then becomes, what will you do at that point? We knew that our phone's hotspot was probably strong enough for us to Zoom through our phone. And so that was our backup solution to losing the internet. But talking through what your solution will be. I also think the other thing is no one knows what's going on in your home or your technology but you, which means you have to be upfront, assertive, and honest about these tech issues, right? Tech time is built into tournaments this coming year. You should not assert that you've lost, technologies and then like prep for an extra 10 minutes. That's probably just bad karma. But if a technology issue happens, you need to inform people that it's happening and then have a solution for that, whether that be you have your speech recorded, you'll re-give your speech, whatever it may be, but you have to be upfront and honest and be like, no, I had a technology problem. And being assertive about it as well, not letting judges brush it off. The next one I have is lack of recruitment. So this and the next one, which is kind of like tournaments aren't fun anymore, are kind of in the same boat, right? Many people are concerned that because debate is online, you don't get to use traveling as a shiny object to recruit people to debate, which means that the number of novices debating might be less. I think the opposite of this is true, actually. Unless you're like in Georgia where they're letting sports happen. Do any of you live in Georgia? That's good. But like, unless you live there, athletics are not happening in the fall. I'm at a private school, so we're housed in the arts department. Speech and debate is really one of the only things that's functioning almost business as usual. Dance can't really exist. You can't really do plays right now. Like, speech and debate is one of the few activities that was prepared to a certain extent and was able to have a smooth transition to a social distancing online environment. And I think it's particularly true for policy debate. And I think that's really exciting. And I think it's a great way for us to recruit more people, whether it be on our teams or schools in our districts. The second component of this is like the tournaments aren't fun anymore, right? So I had 2 of my girls debating at the TOC, and afterwards they were just like, this sucked. This was not fun. And I get that, right? Like there's a level of, oh, it's really nice, I get to sleep in my own bed. But there's also that level of, it's really hard to not be at a tournament. Part of the reason why we love debate is not just for, competition, which we still get, but it's also that social aspect as well. All of my best friends are still debate coaches. Like, that is still a thing. And so finding solutions and workarounds to that, I think, is really important, so we can still create that level of community. So first and foremost, I would suggest that you reflect on why tournaments are fun for you. Why do you choose to attend tournaments? What aspects of tournaments do you enjoy? Then you should replicate those. So if one of the things you love is doing team dinners, do a team Zoom dinner. You might not all be eating the same thing, but you still are able to have those conversations and still have some sense of community. If it's you getting to see your people, your friends from camp, then coordinate like Zoom meetings between rounds, right? You can still have those conversations. It just requires a little more planning ahead of time. But I think one of the biggest detriments to this coming year is if we do not actively seek to build community, that community will get lost. And so I think actively reaching out and actively doing those things is important. The other thing is you should also brainstorm with your team. What as a team do you enjoy doing, and how can you do that online? Whether that be weekly trivia nights, right? Your team can do weekly trivia. Your team can just prep together. And then the last thing about that is I think one of the other fundamental losses of online debate is you're not just sitting in a squad room or a classroom talking about debate. And I think that's one of the key components to a successful debater is that constant conversation about debate. So all that means is you're on Slack more often, you have Zoom conversations, you text more. You just have to change those channels of conversation. So the next problem that I've kind of outlined is lack of adrenaline at tournaments. So it was really nice that I was able to like wake up extra early and bake cinnamon rolls the first morning of the TOC, but it's different and it feels different, and I get it. I think you need to establish a pre-tournament routine with your partner. So at a tournament, you're normally with your partner almost 24/7. So I think you and your partner need to have a discussion of what your pre-tournament routine is. Whether you get on Zoom and listen to the same music, whether you sit there over coffee and talk about what you're doing for that round one, for not round one because parents probably aren't out, but what your plans are, etc. I think that needs to happen. I also think you have to act like you're a tournament. You cannot roll over in your bed and then hit the round one Zoom link. Like that's probably not going to be a great call for multiple reasons. I think you need to wake up, get dressed, have breakfast if you have breakfast, drink coffee if you drink coffee, and be ready to debate. And I think your debate station cannot be your bed. It can be in your bedroom, but it cannot be your bed. So I think that is also a key component. The last thing I would say is I think cross-X is also probably a unique problem in an online debate community. And I don't really have a solution to this. Here are my thoughts on it. Maybe you all will have some, but I think it becomes significantly harder to not have an issue of talking over one another in cross-X. And with Zoom, how, you know, it only reads one microphone at once, like that's a problem. And so I think you need to, I think that's one, why stuff like standing is helpful. Two, I think, you know, doing things like being like, well, I have a question still, wait, I have another question. Using nonverbal communication to indicate some of those things I think is helpful. And try not to initiate or engage in a battle of wills, if you will, in terms of who is being heard over the other person in cross-X. I think while you may miss or lose a question or two, I think that will be significantly preferred to people yelling at each other. Like if you ask college coaches or even high school coaches, like what one of their biggest concerns are, they're like cross-X, which is fair. And that used to be a huge ethos building moment in debate rounds. It can still be an ethos building moment. I just think you have to approach it a different way. Be okay if you don't get all of your questions asked. Like that's fine, but you should never start yelling. That's not something that should happen. And then the last thing I would say is the camera should always be on. So even if you are not speaking, having that camera on, I think is a necessary component to the building of ethos. And so the last section I have is silver linings, right? There are things that will suck about this next competition year, right? Especially if you're a senior. If you're a senior, I apologize. Not how people envisioned their last year of high school debate to happen. But I think if we are actively creating good things that come out of it, it'll be okay. It won't be the same. The conclusion is kind of all, don't make me do this for forever, but hopefully that doesn't happen. And so I think there's 3 or 4 silver linings. The first is less travel. While that's a downside, you don't get to go to like Chicago. I think it's a good thing because you're missing less school. It's, less of a strain in terms of stuff like that. The second thing is, I think, healthier schedules. So the very few debate tournaments in the country prior to COVID had you only debate 3 prelims in one day. Like that was very rarely something that happened. And so being able to have healthier schedules, I think, is very important. I think that has forced the discussion. I also think it's going to be cheaper, right? Tournament costs may not go down as much as people think. I really don't think they will. I think part of that is the platform component. But I think the second part of that is, especially for high school programs, they're using, like, we use tournaments as fundraisers. And so I think that doesn't go away. But you're not buying hotel rooms, you're not doing those things. And I think that makes your costs significantly cheaper. I also think it opens the door for who you hire as external coaches, if that's something you do, because it doesn't have to be someone that's willing to leave every weekend to go to a tournament. They can be in their home and still help you, which I think is really nice. I also think it increases the propensity for kids to compete. So if we use my school as an example, I'm currently building the policy program there. It's my first year. It's my second year now. This is my second year. But it's so much easier for me to be able to get my 8th graders to compete at a policy tournament, because I don't have to convince their parents to take them on an airplane across the country first. So I think that's easier. I also think there's also a level of it's less intimidating. So while they were very scared before, it's much less intimidating to sit in front of a computer. And so I think that's also helpful. And I think that's good in terms of building programs. And then I think the last silver lining that I can think of is scrimmages across states. So we have scrimmages with North Broward all the time. We're kind of the only 2, policy programs down here. Sometimes Cypress shows up. But I think scrimmages across states is particularly helpful. So we can, potentially have scrimmages with schools in Atlanta or stuff like that. And that's possible because it's all online. So there isn't that travel component to it. And I think that's also really nice. What questions do you all have, or what did I not cover that you hoped I would cover?
Well, I just have one question. I've heard a lot about some judges not leaving their camera on, and I just kind of how do you think we should deal with that?
I really think tournaments should be I think tournaments should be encouraging everyone that is participating to have their cameras on. Unfortunately, that's not something you can force, right? But I think there certainly should be that encouragement, and there should be verbiage in like tournament procedures that encourage that to occur. We started seeing that, like, I think the TSC was a little shy to do that, but we started seeing that at like NSDA and stuff. And so I think that should hopefully be the trend, to encourage but not require cameras to be on. Unfortunately, you can't do anything about it, but you can certainly model and leave your camera on. I would also, if the judge doesn't have their camera on, verbally check in before you begin speaking. And not, is anyone not ready, but is everyone there and ready, right? Because I think the worst case scenario is you say, is anyone not ready? No one says anything, and then you are halfway through your speech and your judge is like, all right, I'm back. What other questions do you all have? None? Awesome. Well, thank you all so much. I hope you have a great day. And